The situation in Venezuela is worse than you think. With thousands lacking medical care, we expose how deep the health crisis goes. But who's responsible? US sanctions or President Maduro? I'm Imran Garta, and today's Newsmaker is Venezuela's humanitarian catastrophe. For many, Venezuela looks like a country at war. More than 1 million have fled, food and medicine is hard to come by, and thousands of children are at risk of starving to death. Sounds shocking considering the Latin American country sits on one of the world's largest oil reserves. But after a drastic fall in oil prices, the economy started to crumble. Now Venezuelans are in desperate need of aid and a solution to the crisis. But who's to blame? Nicolas Maduro says it's Washington, accusing the US of waging an economic war. But others point the finger at the Venezuelan president himself, accusing the socialist president of utter mismanagement. We sent Sandra Gathmann to Caracas to find out exactly what's going on.
There's a popular saying in Venezuela: "No hay mejor ciego que el que no quiere ver." No man is more blind than he who chooses not to see. In this country, the government is accused of ignoring a health crisis that's become catastrophic. I'm in Caracas to meet Venezuelans who can't afford medicine and fear for their loved ones.
Se pasa mucha hambre, no hay medicamentos y me preocupa mucho la salud de mi hija.
Treatable infections like HIV are now a death sentence.
He visto en promedio 9 personas fallecer diariamente.
Hospitals have no water, but medical staff are often too scared to speak out.
The level of fear in this hospital is incredibly surreal. It's just not normal.
Still, the government insists there's nothing to see here.
Aquí no hay crisis humanitaria. Aquí hay amor. Lo que hay es una crisis de una derecha fascista tratando de destruir a un pueblo libre e independiente.
Mami, ¿dónde está? Mira, mami, ¿quién tengo aquí?
Con permiso.
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
Muchísimo gusto.
Vanessa and her mother, Loli Furtado, only have each other. Most of their family have left Venezuela to live abroad.
Me encantan tus zapatillas.
Pero eres una guerrera.
Ah, no, eso sí.
Como los guerreros de la guerra de las galaxias.
Sí, claro que sí.
Loli has bowel cancer.
Me voy a echar a...
Vanessa was diagnosed with leukemia 3 years ago. The medicine they both need is hard to find or too expensive. When relatives bring them chemotherapy drugs, they have to hide them well.
Este peluche nos lo mandó mi prima, ¿ok? Nos lo mandó de Miami. ¿Qué pasa? Custodio, los mismos policías que están en aduana, le quitan la medicina a los familiares.
¿Y te ha pasado a ti que te han quitado la medicina?
A mi mamá le quitaron una quimio. Cuando ellos vieron que era una quimio para cáncer, el muchacho ya no tenía los dólares para poderle pagar al militar para que le pueda dar la quimio, le pueda devolver la quimio. El militar estaba pidiendo $5 para que le diera la quimio.
Ya yo me convertí en médico y farmacéutica ya.
Sí, ella sabe de todo.
Bueno, fíjate bien. Por ejemplo, este es Mencido, este es el que le da el hospital. Las pastillas de hipertensión que ella usa, valsartán, hidroclorotiazida, se consiguen pero en 4 millones. Mi sueldo es de 4.900.000. ¿Okay? ¿Cómo hago yo para mantenerle a ella su hipertensión?
Sí. Se pasa mucha hambre, no hay medicamentos. Y me preocupa mucho la salud de mi hija. Porque yo no quiero que si yo me muero, quedase ella sola. ¿Quién me la va a atender?
¿Cómo hago para poder ayudar a mi mamá si yo estoy con quimio? ¿Cómo hacemos las dos para poder ayudar? Yo prefiero 1000 veces dejar yo de comer para dárselo todo a mi mamá. Porque mi mamá es lo primero, mi mamá es mi mamá. Y yo, este gobierno tiene que caer
Este gobierno que tiene.
Sí, es horrible.
Todos estamos sufriendo, nadie quiere decir lo que está pasando y yo de verdad que le doy las gracias a ustedes.
Venezuela's rate of inflation at 25,000% has made medicine unaffordable. But the shortages are not new. They began in 2003 when President Hugo Chavez announced foreign currency controls, making it too costly for the pharmaceutical industry to make, buy, or sell drugs.
No saber de las divisas, cómo las vamos a poner, esto nos va a traer dificultades.
Today, medicine is still largely imported, but the country is bankrupt. And the current president, Nicolás Maduro, blames last year's financial sanctions on Venezuelan debt.
1.400 millones de dólares que estaban ya comprometidos para comprar insumos, comprar medicinas y comprar alimentos.
Y nos los tienen congelados desde hace 6 semanas en Euroclear. Las medicinas venezolanas se las están llevando de hace tiempo. Mafias.
But Venezuela has been donating aid abroad. In the last year and a half, more than 600 tons of emergency supplies were shipped to countries like Mexico, Peru, and Cuba, as far as we could count. Meanwhile, shortages of medicine in Venezuela have reached 85%, according to the country's pharmaceutical federation.
¿Fulgram tiene? ¿Concor? No. ¿Glucofage? ¿Diclofenac?
No.
¿Y cefadoxilo?
Sí, llega de vez en cuando.
¿Tramal? ¿Butancol?
No, no lo tengo.
¿Exforge? No. Gracias.
We're finding that a lot of pharmacies are quite hesitant to let us film.
Yasmin, Femexin, algún anticonceptivo.
Velaras. Son más anticonceptivos. No, ahí.
¿Todex?
No.
No. ¿Usted se cansa de decir no?
Sí, me canso de decir no.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
We chose 13 products, a range of antibiotics, anti-inflammatory drugs, and treatment for high blood pressure, basic medicine that most families would need at some point. Now, after visiting 10 different pharmacies around Caracas, we found there was a shortage of 68% of the medicines we were looking for. Some drugs you won't find anywhere. Mauricio has HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. He relies on a daily dose of antiretroviral medicine. The Ministry of Health used to provide the pills, not anymore.
Se habla, y eso son cifras casi oficiales, aquí no hay cifras oficiales para nada, de que deben haber 300.000 personas con VIH. Y solamente 77.000 reciben la atención a través de los medicamentos y todo eso. Bueno, hay 230.000 personas que están a la buena de Dios. En lo que va de año, he visto en promedio 9 personas fallecer diariamente. Amigos, personas que de una manera u otra yo he estado en cualquier centro de salud y les he llevado algún medicamento o he hablado con ellos, o que familiares me han llamado o amigos me han llamado, mira, fulano falleció.
O sea, aquí te llegan llamadas todos los días.
Todos los días y a cada rato. Y la impotencia que me da no poder hacer nada me tiene desesperado. A pesar de que se repite la situación del comienzo de la epidemia, que la gente se muere por complicaciones a causa del SIDA, ahora nos dicen que es mentira, que la gente no se está muriendo por complicaciones a causa del SIDA. Ahora tenemos cómo evitar esas muertes. En los 80 no. Eran muertes que no se podían evitar. Entonces, hoy por hoy son muertes evitables y por evitables despreciables. Me dedico a trabajar con personas con VIH hospitalizadas. Sirvo de intermediario entre donantes de cosas. Inclusive yo he llegado a entregar medicamentos míos, los que yo tomo, los cuales me queda una reserva de un mes más. un mes más y yo sé que se van a acabar y no van a llegar. ¿Cómo estás? ¿Hace cuánto tiempo estás hospitalizado?
Aquí yo estuve 2 meses ya.
2 meses.
Mi mamá está que sube para allá arriba para la dirección y ellos como si nada.
Silencio absoluto también de parte de la dirección.
Exactamente.
¿Qué te trajeron de desayuno?
Nada.
Nada de desayuno.
Y son las 10:30 de la mañana. ¿Y qué cenaste ayer? ¿Qué te dieron de cenar?
No dan cena ni nada.
No dan cena. Terrible. Y esa es la situación que vivimos todos los días, a cada momento, en absolutamente todos los hospitales del país.
An NGO called Go de Vida says more than 13,000 doctors have left Venezuela in the last 4 years. Dr. Carlos Perez is still here, treating people with HIV. He's even made it part of his job to help his patients leave the country.
Eso fue hace como 3 semanas. Y aquí está ahorita, así está ahorita. El cambio, en 18 días después de haber llegado a Colombia. Los pacientes míos tienen apenas 2 alternativas. O emigran del país o ven cómo van falleciendo de amengo. Todo este año ha sido lo más crítico por el desabastecimiento casi de 100% de la disponibilidad de los medicamentos antirretrovirales para la atención de los pacientes con VIH, cuya distribución está en manos del Ministerio de Salud. Tratamos en la medida de lo posible de conseguir medicamentos que han sobrado de pacientes que han fallecido, porque es muy doloroso ver morir a los pacientes sin que ni siquiera huelan la pastilla de tratamiento antirretroviral. Mientras eso está pasando, hay una negación de la realidad con respecto a este ministro de Salud que se empeña en decir que todo está chévere, está inaugurando CDI, está inaugurando salas de emergencia.
Nos encontramos aquí en el Hospital JM de Los Ríos.
The government has been giving medical facilities a facelift, but money has largely been going to community centers that are only able to provide primary medical care. They belong to a social welfare program called Barrio Adentro, an alternative health system introduced by Chavez in 2003.
Prácticamente es un presupuesto tutoriado por la delegación cubana. Entonces, dispersión de recursos, falta de gerencia y un sancocho aquí que está todo aderezado por la parte ideológica.
Meanwhile, Venezuela's public health system is being neglected. Inside the José Gregorio Hernández Hospital, the nurses advised us to hide our cameras and use our phones. Some floors have been abandoned for years. Now there's no running water and no way to clean the bathrooms.
The smell is unbearable.
Here's a new emergency hall, where we're told renovations began months ago. In the meantime, patients are being treated here, in the archive room. Next, we visited the Clínico Universitario, Venezuela's biggest hospital, where nurses gave us a secret tour.
Mira, este es el desayuno del Hospital Clínico Universitario.
They also told us that armed pro-government militia guard every floor.
The level of fear in this hospital is incredibly surreal. It's just not normal, and the workers who are showing us around are very afraid of losing their jobs.
One nurse did agree to speak to me in the kitchen.
Pegando gritos de ayuda porque de verdad que estamos trabajando con las uñas, sin insumos, sin medicamentos, inclusive sin servicio. Actualmente no hay ni siquiera agua en el hospital. Verán cómo se complican todas las áreas críticas porque se nos contaminan los pacientes, pues ni siquiera tienen para el aseo personal. Hay muchas pacientes que han salido de los quirófanos de obstetricia infectadas y la semana pasada fallecieron 2.
¿Y estos insumos que traes aquí son para cuántos pacientes más o menos?
Aquí hay solo para 6 pacientes. Hace poco llegó un camión de medicamentos, sí, la semana pasada, pero nada más traían 500 vancomicinas. Cuando eso se va en una semana en un solo servicio.
Es muy difícil su trabajo.
Sí, es bien difícil cuando tú tienes un solo frasquito de antibiótico y tienes que decidir entre 10 pacientes a cuál se lo coloca.
This is Governor Lacaba, one of Maduro's closest political allies. The health minister didn't respond to our request for an interview.
Venezuelan government controls Venezuela's borders. Shipments of medicine have been blocked. How does that translate to an economic war that's being imposed from the outside?
Well, this is an action called by the US, of course, and with all their allies. But at the end, we are managing to go through this situation, and we're gonna defeat this, and you're going to see on the near future that the situation is gonna improve.
Would you be open to accepting humanitarian aid if it comes with no strings attached, in the same way that Venezuela has donated to Mexico and the Dominican Republic in their hour of need?
I don't, ¿te lo puedo decir en español? I'm not against any help from anybody, because when somebody wants to help you, it's because it's a good friend of yours. And I like that. I agree with that. But the way they're trying to put up this humanitarian help, it's a political thing. Let me explain you why. If you want to send me some medicines and some food, why don't you let me buy it? We're gonna do an operation in the international finance system because of the block. Well, people from the world, we love you, but you're not gonna bust us. You're not gonna defeat us in that way.
Con la nueva Constitución, la salud es un derecho social fundamental, obligación del Estado, quien lo garantizará como parte del derecho a la vida. Yo soy el peor amigo del ministro de Salud. Cada vez que tuitea algo, hablo de las muertes que son su responsabilidad, de las carencias en los centros de salud que son su responsabilidad. Pero, ¿quién denuncia aquí? La Fiscal General de la República, que desde mi punto de vista es parte de esa estructura corrupta, se fue fuera del país. Estamos en total indefensión frente a este Estado.
That was Sandra Gathmann reporting there from Caracas. Well, now to discuss how Venezuela got to this point, I'm joined from Mexico City by Carolina Jimenez. She's the Americas Deputy Director for Research at Amnesty International. In New York, we have Gabriel Hetland. He teaches Latin American Studies at the State University of New York at Albany. And completing our panel from London is Latin America analyst Haber Yapımcılarından. I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Carolina, we've just seen a fairly harrowing report which shows that the economy collapsed and the healthcare system in particular is in absolute tatters in Venezuela. Who messed this up, Carolina? Who's responsible?
Well, definitely there are different reasons that explain how Venezuela got into this, major human rights crisis. But we strongly believe that it is the responsibility of the Venezuelan government to address the crisis. What we have seen so far is a flat, plain denial from the government about its, when it comes to fulfilling its obligations, when it comes to acknowledging even that there is a human rights crisis. And because the government continues to deny the existence of the crisis, it is indeed very difficult for the government to adopt the necessary measures to mitigate and to start solving this incredible crisis that affect Venezuelans daily in very real and dramatic ways. So beyond knowing who is responsible for the crisis, what we do strongly believe is that it is the government's responsibility to address the crisis. And what we see is the opposite. We see a government that strongly denies there is a crisis and that is certainly not taking the necessary steps to make things better.
Okay, Javier Farque, is this a government in denial, just easily blaming Yankee imperialism instead of looking inward and actually taking responsibility?
The government is aware of there is a crisis. Carolina is totally inaccurate in relation to the denials by the government there is a crisis. we were talking about the health service here and the responsibility the government has to solve it. I agree with that completely. In November 2017, the government of the United States blocked a payment that the government of Venezuela wanted to make based on the Pan American Health Organization to acquire medicines for vaccines, which means that the schedule for the vaccination of people had to be moved in Venezuela. In November 2017, Colombia blocked a supply of medicine for anti-malaria, which had been bought by the Venezuelan government to a laboratory in Colombia. In November, the same month, three big laboratories in the world, Basta, Abbott, and Pfizer, refused to issue export certificates for suppliers for medicines that treat cancer. And this year, only this year, £9 million was blocked, $9 million were blocked, a payment were blocked by the US in order to buy dialysis supplies. Furthermore, in the hospital, just to give you one example, in the hospital Adolfo Pons of the city of Maracaibo, they discovered a clandestine warehouse of medical supplies that had been hidden by somebody who fled to Peru once they were found out. So yes, the government's greatly responsible for what's going on, but to believe that only the government has responsibility on this, and this is some kind of like anti-imperialistic thing, is wrong. There is concrete measures which are preventing the Venezuelan government from importing and getting the supplies they need to improve the situation in the health service.
Okay, so Gabriel Hetland, the place is a mess and Venezuela is not being given the best chance to deal with the crisis by the actions of countries such as the United States, according to Javier Farge. Is he on the right track, Gabriel?
Yeah, I would agree with much of what Javier says, although I think that Carolina's right that the government is very responsible for the crisis, which Javier is also saying. In particular, the currency policy, which has been devastating the country in so many ways. They've known about it for years and years, and they've continuously failed to take care of it. So that is completely on the government. However, it's also true that the United States has taken many actions, not just in the last year with sanctions, but going back years and years, blocking the Venezuelan government's ability to address the crisis. They have blocked loans from the U.S. and from European banks going back many years. They've also blocked business deals with companies that wanted to do business with the Venezuelan government. So the government has a tremendous responsibility, but the United States' actions have been making the crisis worse, not better.
Right. But Gabriel, the fact that they can both at the same time say there's no humanitarian crisis and on the other hand accept European Commission funding to the tune of almost $50 million. What's going on there? Tell me what's going on in their thinking, Gabriel.
Well, there's a lot of contradictions. I mean, I think that it's true that parts of the Venezuelan government have mildly acknowledged the existence of a crisis, but they've continuously blamed it on the economic war, which is only a partial factor in the crisis, and they have downplayed the severity of the crisis. So the Venezuelan government needs to acknowledge its own dramatic responsibility for the crisis and the profound severity of the crisis and take immediate actions. The international community needs to step back from taking actions that damage the Venezuelan government's ability to help the people and that damage the people of Venezuela's ability to recover from a truly devastating crisis. So effectively, there's very shared blame to go around on all sides right now.
Carolina, is it wrong for other nations to continue to sanction Venezuela when the situation is so bad, knowing that it's not going to help the people?
I think it is important to acknowledge that we need, to understand much better what the impact of sanctions and other measures, are when it comes to the Venezuelan crisis. But I think it is wrong to conclude that the sanctions are the reason why the crisis is not getting better and it's not being solved. The truth is that, a lot of UN agencies could be now providing Venezuela with aid if the Venezuelan government effectively requested this aid. To request this aid, to request international cooperation, I will insist, the government needs to acknowledge there is a crisis. I disagree with the view that the government has mildly, recognized there is one. The government keeps attacking human rights defenders and international human rights organizations whenever we make these calls for the government to accept international cooperation. And I believe those attacks against human rights defenders are a clear indicator that the government doesn't want to hear the message. And the message is that it doesn't matter that some financial restrictions are being imposed on the government. All governments, regardless of the financial restrictions imposed on its economy, are under the obligation to fulfill, people's right to health. And if it needs to request international cooperation openly and transparently, it should do so. I mean, there shouldn't be any ideological reason or government policy put before the needs of the Venezuelans.
Okay, so Javier, people have been reportedly selling their children. Our own reporter found that there's no running water in hospitals, no meds in the pharmacies, cancer patients don't have medication and so forth. So is the Venezuelan government being stubborn, and why is it being so stubborn? So stubborn that it doesn't want to ask for help from the UN agencies?
I agree with Carolina and with your question that the Venezuelan government should acknowledge that there is a serious crisis. They already have, but they haven't received any help because they have not requested. By the way, any kind of aid that would come to Venezuela, which is of course very important, would only solve part of the problem, because the big picture is that Venezuela needs to have access to hard currency to be able to get big supplies of medicines, and drugs and equipment to be able to solve the problem in the health service. So on the one hand, yes, you're absolutely right, Carolina. The Venezuelan government should acknowledge the problem in terms of accepting the aid that has been offered, but at the same time, this can only solve part of the problem if the lack of access to financial markets still continues against Venezuela. They won't be able to buy the supplies of medicines and drugs they require to solve the problem. So so there's a combination of both. And Carolina is absolutely right. It's a combination of both. And Gabriel, I agree with Gabriel that there's a sense of stubbornness in relation to some of the measures that the government has not decided to change, like the exchange rate mechanism, which is absolutely absurd because it's creating a black market, which is creating inflation. That has to be removed from the Venezuelan economy before it's late now, before it's too late.
Gabriel, let's talk about legitimacy. Even if we can conclude that the last election was completely free and fair and Maduro deserves to be president, even though the main opposition parties or the main opposition bloc had boycotted, even if we look at his creation of that National Constituent Assembly and we say, okay, that was fine, that was all okay, and he's still legitimately the democratic president of Venezuela. At what point of the humanitarian crisis and the economic collapse can we say that this government has lost legitimacy because ultimately they failed to take care of their own people?
I think right now. I mean, I think that, there's major problems with the last election. There's major problems with the Constituent Assembly election, very credible allegations of fraud in the Constituent Assembly election. There was leading candidates from the opposition banned in this last election. So just because of that, the government has lost legitimacy in the eyes of the international community. But I think perhaps the most important sector in Venezuela, which is lurking in the background, would be the poor and the popular sectors. And in their eyes, the government's legitimacy has frayed tremendously. We saw this in December last year when there was shipments for the emergency program, the CLAP program, which is still around years after it was started, for pernil, pork roast, which is a Christmas special, and it didn't arrive on time, and there was popular sector protests and sort of sackings, lootings that were happening in Caracas and other parts of Venezuela by the popular sectors, which continue by and large to be relatively supportive of the government, but much, much less supportive than they were 5 years ago and much less supportive than they were 10 years ago. So I think the longer the crisis goes on and the longer the government fails to take care of it, notwithstanding the responsibility of the United States, the more legitimacy the government will lose, not only with the opposition, not only with the international community, but more importantly with the popular sectors, which have been the only thing keeping the government in power up to this point, in addition to repression and fraud, which have been increasing in the last several years.
Javier, are the Bolivarian revolutionaries losing the streets?
Well, Maduro lost votes. There's no question about that. He got 5.8 million votes, less than the usually 7 to 8 million votes that the Bolivarian constituency, if you like, has had for the last few years. So yes, of course, they have lost support. What happens is that in 2015, when the opposition won the elections of the National Assembly, many Chavistas stayed at home and decided not to vote in protest for the situation in Venezuela. The opposition won, and the opposition started to try to dismantle all the social reforms that Chavez had implemented. And that's why many people who voted for the Chavismo before and who stayed at home at the time decided to vote again, because they did not want to lose those social projects that are still going on in Venezuela, in spite of the fact they don't have the money. In terms of legitimacy, yes, the opposition has denounced fraud, but they have not shown any proof. Now, there is a system. I was an observer for the regional elections in October last year, 15th of October last year. I went to Lara State, which used to be run by Henry Falcón, who became the candidate for the opposition for the presidential elections some weeks ago. And he admitted his defeat. I saw the process. I didn't see any reason to believe that it was not legitimate. Right. There is an automatic recount of votes that would have been able to enable the opposition to denounce fraud if there was that. But the legitimacy has to be not only on the ballot boxes, but also on the measures that the government should take to solve the problem. And I understand why people are starting to be skeptical about that, but it's not entirely the fault of Maduro.
Carolina, final question for you. He has released 39 political prisoners at the beginning of the month and made some overtures at reconciliation. What does that tell you? Is there hope that things can turn around? Never mind the humanitarian crisis, but the thing underpinning all of this, the political crisis, might be resolved sometime soon?
We celebrate that there are releases of people who have been detained due to political reasons, but we do believe that they should have not been in prison in the first place. Even though indeed the number of people released have been increasing, if we follow the data from some local human rights organizations that show that at least 320 people detained for political reasons are still in prison, we still need to see much more commitment from the government when it comes to releasing people who, I insist, should not have been in prison in the first place. These are important gestures and important steps to improving the human rights situation, but so much more needs to be done that if we don't see a stronger and more clear commitment from the government to stop detaining people, release those people who are still detained, and address the human rights situation in general, including issues related to right to health and to food, it is very possible that the suffering and the dramatic situation of Venezuelans will continue.
Okay, I've got to move on, but it's been great talking to all of you, Carolina Jimenez, Gabriel Hetland, and Javier Farque. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still to come, Colombians get ready to vote again in a second-round showdown. Could a presidential victory for Iván Duque destroy the peace deal with the FARC? On Sunday, Colombians head to the polls for the second time in less than a month. The presidential vote just a few weeks ago proved inconclusive after no candidate won a majority. Now Gustavo Petro and Iván Duque will go head-to-head. Many portray it as a battle between left and right, but it's perhaps even more a referendum on the historic but controversial peace agreement with the FARC rebels. Duque thinks it's far too lenient, but Petro supports the deal. Right now, Duque seems the man to beat. And if he wins, could it reignite a conflict that killed thousands? Haber Yapımcılarından reports.
There's no middle ground in this race. Iván Duque is the hardliner, and his rival Gustavo Petro is from the opposite end, on the left. The divide between them reflects the feeling in Colombian society. In last month's election, Duque received 39% of the votes, and Petro 25%. Voters seem to be fed up with the moderates. But with neither candidate winning the required 50%, they'll face each other again in a runoff on Sunday. Petro's popularity is unprecedented. It's the first time in Colombia's history that such a progressive candidate has reached the second round of an election. So what's at stake? The peace deal with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia is under threat. The current president, Juan Manuel Santos, signed the agreement with the rebels in 2016. Santos was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. The deal ended 50 years of war that left 220,000 people dead and forced 7 million from their homes. But it was criticized for being too soft on the rebels and for allowing them to form a political party. But Duque says he wants to make changes to the accord.
We need to guarantee that those responsible for crimes are really committed to the country, that they do not fall back to their ways, that they tell the truth and assume responsibility in carrying out their sentences.
In contrast with Duque, Petro, himself a former guerrilla, supports the peace agreement.
This is what we're going to talk about at the ballot boxes. A return to violence or building peace. We have given it our all. We're not playing with fire so as to have a Colombia that is not at peace.
But since the conflict has ended, it seems voters now have other priorities, such as jobs and inequality. Duque is a traditional conservative and wants to cut taxes for the rich and boost mining. He's also supported by former President Álvaro Uribe, who remains popular among Colombia's conservatives. Duque's challenger says he wants to redistribute wealth, to make the poor richer, and to move Colombia away from its reliance on oil and coal. And as the former mayor of Colombia's capital, Bogota, Petro championed human rights and passed social welfare reforms. But this has scared many in the country's business community. Some fear Petro's policies will drag Colombia into the same economic crisis affecting Venezuela. So will Colombia move further to the right on Sunday, or will a leftist finally become president? Hader Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Bogota is Paloma Valencia. She's a Colombian senator in Iván Duque's Democratic Center Party. In Washington, we have Peter Hakem. He's President Emeritus and a Senior Fellow at the Inter-American Dialogue. And completing our panel from Bogota is human rights specialist Beatriz Bejarano. She's the founding member of Embracing the Dialogue, an initiative that supports the peace process. I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Senator Paloma Valencia, let me start with you. If Duque wins, does this mean the whole peace process is gone and the FARC are going to pick up their weapons again and you guys are sliding back into civil war?
No, absolutely no. First, we didn't have a civil war. We have a conflict with terrorists who committed crimes against humanity. And the people in Colombia are willing to make an agreement with them in exchange of some things, especially the justice. We cannot let them just go without any justice for the crimes they committed. Now they're going into office. They have 5 places in the Senate, 5 places in the Chamber of Representatives, and they didn't even tell the truth. They didn't pay jail, and they are responsible of committing crimes against humanity. So we think we should have a renegotiation of some points, especially those who said that they can go into office without paying the punishment for the crimes they committed.
Right.
Second, we think that it's very important for them to leave the business of narco-trafficking, because narco-trafficking is the cause of violence in Colombia. And nowadays we're seeing now that Santrich, one of the heads of the FARC organization, has been asked for extradition by the U.S. because they have evidence that shows that he has been keeping the business of narco-trafficking. So we think we should also talk about this openly and renegotiate the terms in which they should abandon all the trafficking business.
Right. So Beatriz Bejarano, it makes sense, doesn't it? This is what the people want. You have a candidate, Duque, coming out and saying it wasn't a great deal. It needs to be renegotiated. They need to pay reparations. We shouldn't have them run for office. And now it's most likely that the people will vote for him. This is democracy. They're unhappy with the deal. So why not renegotiate it? Is that how you see it?
Not at all. May I remind you and Paloma also that the deal, when it was not accepted after the plebiscite of the 2nd of October 2016, the plebiscite was rejected. The president immediately, President Santos, immediately within hours, was on television announcing that he was having a gathering of those who opposed the peace agreement as it then was. And he gathered all the opponents, and they went through a very painstaking, elaborate process of integrating the majority, the great majority of the issues that the no people, the people who voted no, had. I remember long hours of negotiations, of renegotiating, and the current product of that renegotiation process is even a longer document. It's more than 300 pages long, which is quite a treaty, and it's very carefully gauged to meet most of the issues that the no proponents had at that point.
Okay, so I'm going to give Paloma Valencia a chance to respond in just a second. I want to bring in Peter Hakem for the moment. Peter Hakem, are we wrong in taking it for granted that Duque will probably win and that the deal is then going to be in huge question?
First of all, I think that it looks pretty clear that Duque has a very large lead at this point, and there's no obvious path that Mr. Petro has to overcome that lead. And we're very close to the election, obviously. So yes, I would say it's pretty much a foregone conclusion, although politics always throws up some unusual results. On the peace agreement, I think that it's a mistake to talk about renegotiating the agreement. The agreement was signed between two parties. It brought an end to 50 years of warfare. Certainly an agreement like that, negotiated under time pressure and the like and uncertainties. I think the important part and what the current government has largely failed at is implementation of the agreement. That the question is not whether the punishment should be a little bigger or the hurdles a little higher. There's a whole question of resettling refugees, of redeveloping areas that had been controlled by the FARC. In other words, the question is how a Duque government is going to implement the agreement.
Okay, so let's get Paloma Valencia's response.
He'll probably be a little tougher than his predecessor.
Okay, so.
But it's not a question of renegotiation.
Okay, so Senator Valencia, you're in the minority on this panel here. Fold in your response to both of them here. They both feel that it's a bad idea to renegotiate the deal. Why not just implement it properly? Why do you have to go back to the drawing board?
Because this kind of deals, when you give impunity to terrorists, will give a bad example for the other groups in Colombia who are willing to exercise violence in exchange of some of these benefits. So it's clear for us that it gives a bad example for the society, and it will make Colombia an insecure country, as it happened during the 80s when we negotiated the negotiation in the 80s finished with a constitution, and we had the 90s, which was the most violent period of the modern Colombian history. So what we fear is that we have to make the law prevail in a minimum way, but you have to make it prevail. So you have a big message for all the Colombians, all the people who are willing to get into violence. They have to know that in Colombia, violence will not lead you to impunity and to public positions. And second of all, I think it was a very, at least questionable way in which we won the elections. They modify all the laws to make almost impossible to win the election in the plebiscite, who asked the people for the agreement. We won, and they just sit with us, hear us, and didn't do anything They just ignore the majority of the Colombians who rejected that deal.
Okay, so Beatriz Vajerano, there's a feeling then, both from within the government and among the people who would be electing Duque to the top position here, that peace has come at a price that they can't accept. Peace has come with too little justice and too little accountability. Do you respect that opinion?
I respect it fully, of course. Democracy means respecting the opposite side's view of things. But I have to disagree with Paloma. This has been a peace process that took 5 long years. The agreement was crafted with the utmost care to give the possibility of investigation, prosecution, and punishment. There is no impunity. I'm sorry. It is not too lenient. It has the mechanisms in place. It foresees investigation, prosecution, punishment, sentencing, all the hallmarks of a justice system. It's transitory. It meets the standards of the international community. It meets the standards of the International Criminal Court. It has been lauded by many international organizations. We've had the backing of the European Union and the United Nations all along. I think this gives a guarantee that there will be no impunity. I with all my respect for Paloma as a person, as a woman, and for her party, because I am a Democrat, I think you're wrong. I think maybe a rereading of the point on victims, point 4 of the agreement, would be advisable.
So, Paloma Valencia, Beatriz Vajerano respects you, but she thinks you're wrong.
No, I think I'm not wrong. If you prosecute someone and you sentence him, if you punish him, and he committed crimes against humanity, he should go to jail. You shouldn't go just to go and paint a wall, as is stated. Of course, these sentences do not exist at this point. And when they exist, we're going to suit them to the International Court. And I'm sure they will be prosecuted by the International Court. I have the trust in the international system, and there will not be impunity for the heads of the FARC. So time will tell who's wrong and who's not.
Peter Hakem, looking forward, it seems as if Petro didn't quite strike the right chord amongst voters. He used to be M19. He was a fan of Hugo Chavez publicly. I guess it wasn't a good look for many people given the zeitgeist right now. But on the other hand, people are saying Duque would just be Alvaro Uribe version 2.0. Is that fair?
Well, I mean, I think that both candidates, as happens in any election, they exaggerated their weaknesses, the opposition, and the press likes to sort of talk about conflict and disagreement. The fact is that Duque is not an extreme right-winger. Duque is a reasonably moderate conservative that probably will run a government that's very, very much continuity rather than huge changes. The peace agreement was not a major item in the election, according to most polling, that domestic issues and the implementation of the agreement, if there was any reason for it, was the center of the election. And I think that Petro is seen by many in Colombia as being overly ideological, not quite as consistent and strong as an Ivan Duque. Sure, Uribe has influence. He will continue to have influence. My guess is, though, that when Duque takes the presidency, he will act like a president and he will be in charge.
Okay, and we'll wait to see if that happens. what happens with the deal with the FARC. We'll be watching it very closely. Now is the worst part of my job. It's when I have to thank you all because I want to continue, but I'm out of time. And I'm sorry for that. Paloma Valencia, Peter Hakem, and Beatriz Bejarano, I thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Thank you.
Want answers, and it's absolutely right. And that's why I am today ordering a full public inquiry into this disaster. We need to know what happened. We need to have an explanation of this. We owe that to the families, to the people who have lost loved ones, friends, and the homes in which they lived.
That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.